the first poem is called The Great Molasses Flood. And there's an epigraph I'll just explain. In 1919 in the North End, there was actually this huge molasses flood where a 50-ton tank of molasses exploded and ended up killing 21 people and drowning a number of horses in the North End. So there's just an epigraph from the Boston Post about it. The Great Molasses Flood. With prohibition on the horizon and the demand for rum about to take off, no one could convince the supervisor that the structure of his tank was unsafe, or what would happen if it did combust. 21 dead under 50-foot waves. It's hard to imagine something so viscous and laggard on the spoon lifting trains, flooding alleyways and drowning horses, like the timid neighbor who ups and trades suburban life for a Swedish au pair, leaves some rush note about the constraints of his job. I guess we could blame both the affair and the tank's collapse on the need for more screws. But such logic, though clever enough, offers too simple an answer. Unless, of course, by screws we're referring to nuts and bolts. For bolt, after all, means both to tightly secure and spring suddenly. And it's whenever I've felt locked down by the thick of my daily grind that I've most needed to, well, go nuts and bolt. But it's not just some convenient punchline. The Great Molasses Flood. But a title. I've spent my life straddling the line between feeling engaged and feeling bridled. And bolt is proof that the two can share a single body, meet in the middle. Though even then I've learned more layers reveal themselves like Russian nesting dolls. Insides turn into outsides, beasts become layers to their own bellies, and fair-minded bells. It's all so unreliable. You pin down one truth and outpours a flood of reversals. Yet we keep digging, confident that we're bound to reach some center. No longer sure, though, if by bound we mean certain, or tied down, or perhaps even leap away. Next poem's called Folding Centers. In the movie, the lightning transformed the sand into long, thin strips of glass. And I thought of Jarrell and his thunderstorms. How in a lifetime a man might be graced with such streaks of clarity 5 or 6 times. Enough to make the hearing loss feel like a sound trade. The wet, itchy socks, mere SOP. But real fulgurates, I soon learned, are root-like and hollow, about as sexy as their name, which for me held the allure of affirmation. Even when lightning flashes, the results are opaque and granular. Not to trade what fuses for what confuses, or applaud the postmodern centerfold who, instead of bearing it all, confesses to folding centers. But clarity has failed us too many times. It is as clear as glass, we say, then watch our patios fill with dead sparrows. As water, we declare, until we reach in and watch ripples form, until we grow dizzy from chasing circles. This poem's called Droppings. It might be the crumbled ash from a match, or toasted sesame seed off a loaf of multi-grain bread. Though my stomach seems to know right away when there is life behind the walls. Something about the pinched ends. No different, say, than the slightest lift in my wife's voice, the imperfect pitch that tells me she's upset long before she tells me she's upset. So we learn to trust speech more than language, less than language. Believe in the subtle twitch of the eye over the keenly chosen word, until a fleck of dust settles in an eyelid just as we're coming clean. Or gas rises in our digestive tract, and our boss assumes that pang in our colon is proof of a passive-aggressive streak. Perhaps it's better to ignore the averted glance and nervous tick, put up walls and dismiss the gnawing behind them, slope bricks across the top, and call it coping. Better to be wrong, we think. Better to unset the traps, duct tape some holes, and settle the mind. And then one day, we go to fill the teapot and find a mouse dead in the sink. More humane this way, we say, but now we have to touch that limp body, feel its warmth in our hands. Wrestling with angles. I used to think corners were the least edgy thing around. Show me two pointed lines converging, and I'd see the frame of a cage. And all those manufactured shapes, lawns, file folders, tennis nets with their rows of right angles and their upright columns, were plain figures indeed. I longed for raw forms, the tangled coils of intestines, say, being scavenged by ravenous crows, or winding rivers and those untrusting steps sideways on jagged, uneven rocks. But a body can only stand so much twisting and turning. A back twinges, a knee locks, and soon mountains make for nice scenery. We return to thinking inside of the box, knowing by now that orderly and secure shapes are mere facades. Think of an EKG and a flat line on a rectangular screen. The making of a poet. The sky couldn't have been more glorious. Pinks and purples above the dark ocean, which made him long even more for all the girls who weren't speaking to him, as he sipped his can of stale, lukewarm beer, worried that the flat taste on his tongue was the taste of inaction, and that he was destined to forever flirt with the idea of flirting. His eyes stung from all the smoke that had begun to float his way, but just when he couldn't stand sitting there any longer, head down and withdrawn, he looked up and noticed the sun was both setting and resetting at the same time. And it dawned on him that all contrasts were made to blend. He wasn't sure what that meant, but he was drawn to the sound of it. And when the cute blonde beside him placed her hand on his thigh and warned him not to stare too long lest he go blind, he knew then that inward and onward would one day merge into the same word. The poem's called Good Grief. The day after my great aunt was buried and my house freed of relative strangers, I snuck downstairs to watch some late night soiree. I was 12, with dreams of being a ninja or nudist. And here at last was a movie with both. Large-breasted women in danger. Later that week, as we sat Shiva, I recited the unadulterated prayers. But every time I tried to breathe, closed my eyes and clenched my jaw, naked breasts would jiggle in fear. I didn't know back then how to endure such braided emotions, how to allow the undertow to undergird. I remember the first time one of my students died. This was years ago in Africa. I wanted to write home and tell my brothers about the bucket brewed beer, the shovels and stones. But the kid's name was Big Boy. Big Boy. It was too absurd to include. I almost changed it to Robert or Lungidzai, but I worried that would cheapen the sanctity, as though getting bit by a mosquito and dying days later wasn't cheap enough already. But Big Boy? Big Boy was a name for satire. Alexander Portnoy thrusting forward as the most infamous masturbator of the 20th century. His court apple calling out, "Shove it in me, Big Boy," giving a whole new meaning to soft-core porn. And I feared that such feral joy would undermine my romantic despair, put the fun in funereal, and destroy the sympathy I craved. Not even Shakespeare, who tried to separate his comedies from his death-filled tragedies, is spared such subversions. Right before Othello dies upon his kiss, Lodovico proclaims, "Oh, bloody period." And it does not matter how many times you explain that period here means interval of time, a room of ninth graders will giggle in pain as a fellow gurgles on blood. There are some stories, though, where the two are so interlocked you can barely tell the dovetails from the leapfrogs. For me, it always comes back to Germain, a misspelling of Germain, tattooed on his right bicep. And though he jokes, I'll just flex and tell the girls, Germain. This is permanent. Curse and cursive converged into an indelible design. If only there weren't the preconceived notions we expect grief to come in stages, and when instead a stagecoach arrives, we climb clumsily in and try to triage the tragic from the comic. We hurry this way or that when all signs point to merge. This poem's called Close to Closure. Say someone dies and leaves an envelope buried in her underwear drawer, sealed and carefully inscribed to be opened after my death. Imagine the usual sentiments inside: regret and gratitude, perhaps not a complete bearing of the soul, but a distinct voice at least, an attitude you'd recognize, until you reach the slight slights and buried barbs, grievances that allude to you. The last word's not the only word to last. Still, it would be nice if the words inside of letters were as mutable as the letters inside of words. If we could set aside those hurtful asides, or turn them into clauses. Watch how the intent would shift from incite to insight if, even if we weren't that close, slid to the beginning of the sentence. The even if evened out in the closing. Or what if we switch the tense to not tense? Oh, I know we can't change what words mean, but we do have means to negotiate distance, measures to slow us down, marks that demand separation, so that for a few seconds we might step back and with a clear mind observe our surroundings through a second lens. All that guilt that had just enveloped us, suddenly feeling sealed off, contained. So we had our first daughter about 4 months ago, and it changed our life very, very quickly. So this poem is called Nothing Archaic About It. She wakes and cries out with an onslaught of needs, beckons us like the torso of Apollo. You must change your daughter. And to hear her tempestuous throes as we fumble with the snap of her buttons is to realize how easily change throws us all off balance. These tattered patterns of sleep, our quarters cramped into aches, the relentless demand to put down our work, books, forks. Not that it doesn't feel right, but the right in right now is intensive. Our ends have never felt so loose. The tight fit of our best swaddle is tentative in the fits of her sleep. Even on weekends we're up before 3. Something has to give. But we hold on, holding her, tired, weakened, and something else inside of us awakens.